The summer of 1711 descended upon Lower Manhattan like a suffocating wool blanket soaked in brine. The air hung thick and motionless between the narrow Dutch-style buildings that crowded the southern tip of the island, their steep gables casting knife-thin shadows that offered no relief. Along the waterfront, where the East River lapped against rotting wooden pilings, the stench of fish guts, human waste and tar merged into a single oppressive miasma that made breathing feel like swallowing. This was New Amsterdam no longer. The English had rechristened it New York 47 years prior, but the Dutch architectural bones remained, as did the Dutch families who had built their fortunes on the backs of enslaved Africans since the 1620s. Diana stood at the edge of what would soon become Wall Street, her hands pressed against the small of her back, feeling the weight that had been growing inside her for 7 months. She was 28 years old, though no official record would ever confirm this. Born into slavery in this very city, she had never known another life, never tasted the freedom that white colonists proclaimed as their God-given right, even as they denied it to those who looked like her. Her skin, the rich brown of polished mahogany, glistened with sweat in the relentless July heat. Beneath her coarse linen shift, the only garment her enslaver, Robert Livingston, had provided, her belly protruded, round and firm with the life she carried. The construction site sprawled before her like an open wound in the earth. Men, most of them black, all of them enslaved, hauled massive logs of oak and pine that would form the wooden palisade wall meant to protect the colonial settlement from potential attacks. The irony was not lost on Diana. They were building walls to protect white colonists while being worked to death by those same colonists. The wall would stretch nearly half a mile from the Hudson River to the East River, a barrier that would give its name to a street and eventually to the financial heart of a nation that would be built on stolen land with stolen labor. Robert Livingston strode through the construction site with the confidence of a man who believed divine providence had ordained his superiority. 43 years old, red-faced from both the sun and his fondness for imported rum, Livingston represented the new breed of English entrepreneurs who had flooded New York after the Dutch surrender. He wore a wig, despite the heat, a symbol of status he refused to abandon even when practical sense suggested otherwise. His contract with the colonial government to construct the fortification was worth £300 sterling, an enormous sum that would be paid regardless of how many enslaved people died in the process. Diana had been leased to Livingston by her legal owner, the widow Margaretha van Rensselaer, for the duration of the construction project. The arrangement was common in colonial New York, where enslaved people were treated as mobile capital, rented out like tools or livestock to whoever needed labor. Diana had worked in domestic service her entire life, cooking, cleaning, caring for white children who would grow up to enslave others. But Van Rensselaer, facing mounting debts after her husband's death, had decided Diana could earn more as construction labor. The fact that Diana was 7 months pregnant had not entered into the calculation. Pregnancy did not exempt enslaved women from work in colonial New York. If anything, it made them more valuable. They were, after all, producing more property. The morning of July 14th, 1711, began at 4 o'clock, as every morning did for the enslaved laborers. Diana rose from the pallet of straw she shared with 3 other enslaved women in Livingston's warehouse on Pearl Street. Her back ached with a deep grinding pain that radiated from her spine to her hips. The baby moved inside her, a flutter of kicks against her ribs that both comforted and worried her. She had seen pregnant women work until they dropped. She had seen babies born too early, their tiny bodies buried in unmarked graves behind Trinity Church. She placed her hand on her belly and whispered a prayer, not to the Christian God the missionaries insisted upon, but to the ancestors whose names she barely remembered, whose languages had been beaten out of previous generations. By 5 o'clock, Diana stood in line with 40 other enslaved laborers at the construction site, waiting for the day's assignments. The sun had not yet risen, but the heat already pressed down like a physical force. Livingston's foreman, an Irish indentured servant named Patrick O'Brien, who compensated for his own precarious social position by brutalizing those beneath him, walked the line with a leather whip coiled at his belt. The whip was rarely used at the Wall Street construction site, not out of mercy, but out of economics. Damaged property decreased in value, and Livingston was particular about maintaining the resale condition of enslaved laborers he did not own. Instead, O'Brien employed strategic deprivation, reduced rations for slow workers, denial of water breaks, threats of sale to the brutal sugar plantations of the Caribbean, where life expectancy for enslaved Africans averaged 7 years. Diana had learned to keep her head down, to work through the pain, to become invisible in the way that survival demanded. "You there!" O'Brien's voice cut through the humid morning air, his finger jabbing toward Diana. "Stone detail today. We need the foundation trench filled before the governor's inspection next week." His eyes flickered briefly to her swollen belly, then away, as if pregnancy were merely an inconvenient detail rather than a human reality. "Can you manage, or should I tell Mr. Livingston you're refusing work?" The question was not a question. Refusal meant punishment, whipping, sale, separation from the few people she knew in this world. Diana nodded, her throat too dry to speak. Stone detail meant hauling rocks from the collection point near the river to the foundation trench, a distance of nearly 200 yards. Each stone weighed between 30 and 60 pounds. She would be expected to make 50 trips before the midday meal break. As dawn broke over the East River, painting the water in shades of copper and blood, Diana bent to lift her first stone. The weight of it, combined with the weight of her pregnancy, made her knees buckle momentarily. She steadied herself, adjusted her grip, and began walking. 30 pounds of granite pressed against her chest, 7 months of pregnancy pressed against her spine. The distance stretched before her like an infinite corridor of suffering. Around her, the construction site came alive with the sounds of enslaved labor. The thud of axes against timber, the scrape of shovels in rocky soil, the grunts of men hauling logs twice their weight. 42 enslaved people worked on the wall that summer. 36 men, 6 women. Their names, when recorded at all, appeared in ledgers as property. Negro man Caesar, aged 30, valued at $50. Negro woman Diana, aged approximately 28, skilled in household work, currently pregnant, valued at $45. Deal. The reduction of human beings to inventory was so normalized in colonial New York that even Quaker abolitionists, who would later document Diana's case, initially struggled to see enslaved people as fully human. New York in 1711 was a slave society, not merely a society with slaves. Nearly 20% of the colonial population was enslaved, approximately 1,500 black men, women and children held in bondage in a total population of 7,000. The percentage was higher than in Virginia at the time. Manhattan's economy ran on enslaved labor, the docks, the shipyards, the construction projects, the wealthy households. Dutch and English colonists alike participated enthusiastically in the system, purchasing enslaved Africans directly from ships that docked at the East River wharves, advertising sales in the New York Gazette, writing elaborate legal codes to control every aspect of black life. The slave codes of colonial New York were particularly draconian. Enslaved people could not gather in groups of more than 3 without white supervision. They could not own property, testify in court against white people, or learn to read. They could be executed for striking a white person, even in self-defense. They could be burned alive for arson, a punishment specifically reserved for black convicts. And they could be worked to death with no legal consequence to their enslavers, because the law recognized enslaved people as chattel, property that could be used up and discarded like any other resource. Diana made her first trip to the foundation trench without incident, though by the time she returned to the stone pile, her breath came in shallow gasps. The baby kicked frantically, as if protesting the conditions. She bent for the second stone, felt a sharp pain lance through her lower back and froze. For a moment she thought her water had broken, but no, it was only sweat, running in rivulets down her legs, soaking into the packed dirt beneath her feet. "Move faster!" O'Brien's voice cracked across the site, like the whip he carried. "Livingston's paying for labor, not daydreaming." Diana lifted the second stone and began walking. Her vision swam slightly in the heat. She had eaten nothing since yesterday afternoon, a small piece of cornbread and a cup of water, the standard ration for enslaved workers on the project. Livingston provided minimal food, not out of cruelty, but out of calculated economics. Feed them just enough to keep them working, but not enough to reduce profit margins. By the time the sun reached its zenith, transforming the construction site into an open-air furnace, Diana had completed 23 trips. Her hands bled from gripping rough stone. Her shoulders screamed with accumulated strain. The baby had stopped moving an hour ago, and this terrified her more than her own pain. She had seen this before, the stillness that preceded death in the womb. She pressed her palm against her belly as she walked, trying to feel any flutter of life, any sign that the child inside her still fought to survive. The other enslaved women on the site watched Diana with expressions that mixed sympathy and resignation. There was Phyllis, a woman of about 40, who had been born in what white colonists called the Gold Coast of Africa, sold to a Dutch trader at age 12, and brought to New Amsterdam in chains. There was Bet, younger than Diana, who had lost 2 babies already, one stillborn after a beating, one dead at 3 days old from fever. And there was Rose, who had been sterilized by a botched, forced abortion when her enslaver decided he did not want her producing children who would eventually require feeding. These women could not help Diana without risking their own punishments, so they helped in the only way available to them, silent witness. They would remember, they would tell others. Memory was resistance, when resistance itself was impossible. Robert Livingston appeared at the site around 11 o'clock, arriving in a carriage that lurched over the rutted dirt roads of Lower Manhattan. He stepped down carefully, lifting the hem of his coat to avoid the mud and construction debris. He had come to inspect progress before the colonial governor's visit, and his mood was foul. The project was behind schedule. The summer heat had slowed work. 2 enslaved men had collapsed last week. 1 had recovered, 1 had died. The dead man's owner had demanded compensation, which Livingston had paid grudgingly from his profits. "O'Brien!" Livingston's voice carried the plummy accent of English gentry, though he had been born in Scotland to decidedly ungentry circumstances. "Why are we still on the foundation? The framed timbers should be rising by now." O'Brien hurried over, removing his hat in deference. "The stone hauling is slower than expected, sir. The workers are—" He paused, searching for words that would not suggest criticism of Livingston's management. "The heat is affecting productivity." "The heat affects everyone equally," Livingston snapped, though he himself stood in the narrow stripe of shade provided by a half-constructed wall section. "Double the work requirement this afternoon. No meal break. They can eat when the day's quota is met." Diana, returning from her 24th trip, heard this pronouncement. Her legs nearly gave out. No meal break meant no water. No water meant working for another 6 hours in heat that had already killed 1 man this week. She looked at Phyllis, who looked back with eyes that held centuries of accumulated sorrow. The wall they were building would stand for nearly a century. It would be dismantled in 1699. Wait, no, that was wrong. The wall would stand until 1699? No. Diana was working in 1711. The wall would stand for decades after her death, eventually giving way to a street, then to buildings, then to banks and trading houses that would orchestrate the sale of millions more enslaved people through the domestic slave trade. The New York Stock Exchange would eventually rise blocks away, its early trading including human beings as commodities. Cotton picked by enslaved hands in the South would be financed by Northern capital raised on this very street. Diana's body would help build the foundation of American capitalism, literally and figuratively. But Diana knew none of this as she bent to lift her 25th stone. She knew only heat, pain, thirst, and the terrifying stillness of the baby in her womb. The stone she lifted was heavier than the previous ones, closer to 60 pounds. She adjusted her grip, felt her fingers slip on the sweat-slicked surface, adjusted again. The weight pressed against her pregnant belly. She gasped involuntarily. "Problem, girl." O'Brien's voice directly behind her. Diana shook her head, not trusting herself to speak. She began walking toward the foundation trench, each step deliberate, each breath a conscious act of will. The distance had grown impossibly long. 200 yards might as well have been 200 miles. The afternoon sun turned merciless, baking the packed earth of the construction site until it radiated heat like the surface of a griddle. By 2 o'clock, the temperature had reached what later meteorological records would estimate at 96 degrees Fahrenheit, with humidity approaching 80%. These conditions, extreme even for July in New York, transformed labor into a form of slow execution. For Diana, 7 months pregnant and denied water for 6 hours, the work became a death march in increments of 60 pounds and 200 yards. Her 31st trip to the foundation trench marked the moment when her body began to fail in ways she could no longer ignore. Halfway across the construction site, her vision tunneled. The edges of her sight went grey, then black, leaving only a narrow corridor of light ahead. She stopped walking, swaying slightly, the stone still clutched against her chest. Her heart hammered so violently she could feel it in her throat, her temples, her fingertips. The baby, still no movement. "Please," she thought, "please move. Give me a sign you're still there. Keep moving." O'Brien's shout seemed to come from very far away, as if she were hearing him from underwater. Diana forced her legs to move. One step, another. The world tilted slightly to the left, then righted itself. Sweat poured from her body, soaking her shift until the coarse linen clung to her skin like a second epidermis. She recognized the signs of what white doctors called heat apoplexy, what enslaved people called sun death. She had seen it before. The grey pallor, the stumbling gait, the glassy eyes. Men collapsed in the fields. Women dropped while stirring laundry kettles. Children died while working tobacco farms in Virginia. The human body could only endure so much before it simply surrendered. She reached the trench and released the stone. It tumbled from her arms with a dull thud. For a moment she stood there, staring down at it, unable to remember what she was supposed to do next. Return to the pile. Get another stone. Walk 200 yards. Release it. Repeat. The simplicity of the instructions made the impossibility of continuing even more devastating. Nearby, 2 enslaved men named Cuffy and Prince worked together to maneuver a massive oak log into position. Both were in their early 20s. Both had been born into slavery in New York. Both understood that every day might be their last. They watched Diana with the particular alertness of people who have learned to read catastrophe before it arrives. Cuffy caught Prince's eye and shook his head slightly. "She's not going to make it," the gesture said. Prince nodded grimly. They had watched 3 people die on Livingston's projects over the past 2 years. The pattern was always the same. First the stumbling, then the confusion, then the collapse, then the stillness. Diana turned from the trench and began the long walk back to the stone pile. Each step required a conscious decision. Lift foot, move forward, plant foot, transfer weight, lift other foot. Her mind began to wander, slipping sideways into memories that felt more real than her present circumstances. She remembered being 7 years old, playing with other enslaved children in the narrow alley behind the Van Rensselaer house, before she understood what slavery truly meant, before she learned that her body belonged to someone else. before the weight of absolute powerlessness settled over her like a funeral shroud. She remembered a woman named Abigail, her mother, though they had been separated when Diana was 9 and sold to different households. She remembered Abigail's hands, strong and gentle, braiding her hair in patterns that carried meanings she had never learned to decode. The memories dissolved. She stood at the stone pile again, though she had no recollection of completing the walk. Her hands reached automatically for another stone, but her fingers would not close properly. They trembled, opening and closing spasmodically, as if controlled by someone else. She tried again, failed again. Panic rose in her chest. If she could not work, O'Brien would report her to Livingston. If Livingston grew dissatisfied, he would return her to Van Rensselaer and demand a replacement or a refund. Van Rensselaer might decide Diana had become more trouble than she was worth. Troublesome enslaved people were sold south to the Carolinas or Georgia, where rice cultivation in malarial swamps killed thousands of Africans annually. "I can do this," Diana whispered to herself, to the baby, to the ancestors, to God or whoever might be listening. "I can do this." She bent, wrapped her arms around a stone, and lifted with her legs. The weight seemed to have doubled. She stumbled backward, caught herself, steadied, began walking. She had completed perhaps 20 yards when the first contraction hit. It was not the gentle tightening she had experienced occasionally over the past weeks, the Braxton Hicks contractions that midwives said were the body's practice for eventual labor. This was a seizing, a violent clenching that began in her lower back and radiated forward, wrapping around her belly like an iron band. Diana gasped and dropped the stone. It landed on her right foot, crushing her toes. She felt the pain distantly, as if it were happening to someone else's body. "Get up!" O'Brien appeared at her side, his face scarlet with heat and rage. "Get up now, or I'll drag you to Livingston myself." Diana tried to rise. Her legs would not obey. The contraction continued, intensifying, pulling her into a crouch. She wrapped her arms around her belly, trying to protect what she could no longer control. The baby was coming. 7 months, too early. Babies born at 7 months sometimes survived, but not under these conditions, not without medical care, not to an enslaved mother worth less than the stone she had just dropped. "She's in labor," Phyllis's voice cutting through Diana's spiraling awareness. The older woman had crossed the construction site and now knelt beside Diana, her own work abandoned. "She needs a midwife. She needs water. She needs to stop working." O'Brien stared at Phyllis as if she had spoken in an unknown language. "She needs to finish her quota. We all have quotas." His hand moved to the whip at his belt, not to strike, but to remind them both of the consequences of disobedience. "If she keeps working, she'll die." Phyllis spoke with the flat certainty of someone who had seen this exact scenario play out before. "And Livingston will have to compensate Van Rensselaer for the loss. That's what you should tell him. Not that she's lazy or disobedient, that she's dying and it will cost him money." The contraction released its grip. Diana sucked in air, her chest heaving. For a moment she dared to hope that it had been an isolated incident, a false alarm, her body's mistaken response to extreme stress. Then she felt the dampness between her legs, not sweat, but something else. Her water had broken. The hierarchy of suffering in colonial New York operated according to a brutal calculus, where the value of black life was measured exclusively in economic terms. Robert Livingston's ledger, preserved in the collections of the New York Historical Society, contained a page dated July 14, 1711, with 2 entries that revealed this calculus with terrible clarity. The first entry recorded the day's expenditures. Paid for tar, 12 shillings, paid for rope, 8 shillings, paid for beef for white workers, 1 pound, 4 shillings. The second entry, added later in a different ink, read, "Negro woman Diana, property of M. Van Rensselaer, unable to complete quota due to early labor. Query, liability for medical expenses. Query, compensation for work stoppage." O'Brien stood over Diana's crouched form, calculating. He was not a particularly cruel man by the standards of his time and place, which is to say, he participated in a system of extraordinary cruelty without experiencing it as such. He had been born in County Cork to tenant farmers who barely survived on land owned by English lords. He had endured 7 years of indentured servitude to pay for his passage to the colonies, working under conditions that, while temporary and theoretically voluntary, approached the brutality of chattel slavery. He had learned that survival in America required stepping on those below you to avoid being stepped on yourself. The social structure of colonial New York was a ladder where white indentured servants stood on the backs of free black people, who stood on the backs of enslaved black people, who stood on nothing but dirt and desperation. "Get her to the shed," O'Brien finally said to Phyllis. "Keep her quiet. If Livingston hears she's stopped working, he'll demand she be moved anyway, and the journey will kill her faster than staying put." He looked at Diana with something that might have been pity, if pity could coexist with fundamental denial of humanity. "I'll tell him she's finishing the stone quota. You'll have to work both shares." Phyllis nodded, accepting the impossible bargain. She would haul stones for 2 people in heat that had already nearly killed her once today. She would do this because the alternative was watching Diana die in full view of everyone, becoming one more forgotten casualty of the construction project that would eventually bear Wall Street's name. She hooked her arms under Diana's shoulders and began dragging her toward a small equipment shed at the eastern edge of the construction site. Diana's consciousness flickered. She was being moved. She understood that much. Phyllis's voice murmured words of comfort in a language Diana recognized as Akan, the language of Phyllis's childhood on the Gold Coast, before enslavers had stolen her into the Atlantic trade. Diana's own mother had spoken fragments of a different language, something musical and tonal that had been beaten out of her by her first enslaver in New Amsterdam. The linguistic genocide of slavery operated alongside its physical violence. Destroy the languages, destroy the cultures, destroy the connections to ancestral homelands, create people who existed only in relation to white ownership. The shed was barely 8 feet square, constructed of rough-cut pine boards and used to store tools overnight. It smelled of machine oil, wood shavings, and rat droppings. Phyllis lowered Diana onto a pile of canvas tarps, then wedged the door partially shut to create shadow without fully closing them in. Through the gap, they could see the construction site continuing its brutal routine. Cuffy and Prince still maneuvered timber. Bet and Rose still hauled stones, now working Diana and Phyllis's quotas in addition to their own. The machine of enslavement required that labor never stop, that no individual suffering slow the generation of profit. Another contraction seized Diana, stronger than the first. Her back arched involuntarily. She bit down on her lower lip to keep from screaming. Screaming would alert O'Brien, would alert Livingston, would result in her being dragged from the shed and forced to continue working or be removed from the site entirely. Phyllis pressed a hand against Diana's belly, feeling the violent tightening of premature labor. 7 months, Phyllis asked quietly. Diana nodded, unable to speak through the pain. "The baby might survive if we can get a midwife, but—" Phyllis did not finish the sentence. They both knew there would be no midwife. Enslaved women in colonial New York gave birth attended only by other enslaved women who had learned midwifery through necessity rather than training. White doctors rarely treated enslaved patients unless their owners considered them valuable enough to warrant the expense. And even if a midwife came, what could she do? The baby was coming too early, under catastrophic conditions, to a mother whose body had been pushed far beyond the limits of human endurance. Tentar novamente arpodi editar parte 5, continuação. The contraction subsided, leaving Diana gasping and trembling. Sweat pooled beneath her on the canvas tarps, soaking through the fabric. Her shift clung to her body, transparent with moisture. The heat inside the shed was somehow worse than outside. The enclosed space trapped the day's accumulated warmth, turning the small structure into an oven. Phyllis found a wooden bucket in the corner, checked that it contained water, and brought it to Diana's side. The water was warm and stale, probably left from yesterday, but it was liquid. "Drink!" Phyllis commanded, lifting Diana's head and tilting the bucket to her lips. Diana drank desperately, water spilling down her chin and neck. Her body absorbed the liquid like parched earth absorbing rain. She had not realized how close to complete dehydration she had come, how close to the threshold beyond which the human body simply shuts down. The water revived her enough to return her fully to awareness, which meant returning fully to pain. "How long between contractions?" Diana managed to ask, her voice hoarse. Phyllis glanced through the gap in the door, using the sun's position to estimate time. Maybe 10 minutes, maybe less. It's hard to say. She did not add what they both knew. For a 7-month pregnancy, contractions this strong and this close together meant the baby was coming soon, ready or not. Hours, not days. Maybe not even hours. Maybe minutes. Outside the shed, the rhythm of construction continued. The sound of axes biting into wood, the scrape of shovels, the thud of stones hitting earth. And beneath it all, the quieter sounds of enslaved suffering that white colonists had trained themselves not to hear. The gasping breaths of exhausted workers, the suppressed groans of pain, the whispered prayers in languages that slaveholders had tried to erase. This was the sonic landscape of American slavery, the foreground noise of building and commerce, the background hum of human beings being consumed as fuel. Diana's hand found Phyllis's and gripped it. "If the baby lives," she began. "Don't," Phyllis interrupted. "Don't say it. Save your strength." But Diana needed to speak the words, needed to put them into the world before her world ended. "If the baby lives and I don't, tell them. Tell whoever will listen. Tell them I had a name. Tell them I was a person. Tell them what happened here." Phyllis's eyes filled with tears she could not afford to shed. Water was precious, and crying was a luxury in this place where every resource belonged to someone else. "I'll tell them," she promised, knowing even as she spoke that the promise was likely meaningless. Who would listen to the testimony of an enslaved woman? Who would care about the death of another black body in a colony that had normalized black death as thoroughly as it had normalized black bondage? The colonial legal system of New York in 1711 offered enslaved people no avenue for justice, no mechanism for accountability when they were injured or killed by their enslavers. The slave codes, codified in 1702 and expanded in 1706, explicitly stated that the murder of an enslaved person by their owner was not a capital crime. At most, it was a property crime. The destruction of one's own property, which affected no one but the property owner. If someone killed another person's enslaved worker, they could be sued for damages in civil court, but never prosecuted for murder in criminal court. The law literally did not recognize enslaved people as human beings capable of being murdered. This legal framework had been constructed deliberately, carefully, over decades of colonial legislation. It built upon English common law's definition of property, Roman legal concepts of chattel slavery, and the racial pseudoscience that was emerging in the early 18th century to justify the enslavement of Africans. Legal scholars of the era, men educated at Oxford and Cambridge, men who considered themselves enlightened and civilized, wrote treatises explaining why Africans were naturally suited for enslavement, why they felt less pain than white people, why they were more like beasts of burden than human souls. Another contraction crashed through Diana's body, this one lasting longer than the previous two. She felt pressure building inside her, felt her body preparing to expel the child who was not ready to survive outside the womb. 7 months, 28 weeks. In the 21st century, with advanced neonatal care, a baby born at 28 weeks would have approximately a 90% chance of survival. In 1711, in a tool shed on a construction site, attended only by another enslaved woman with no medical training, the chance approached zero. Through the narrow gap in the shed door, Phyllis watched Robert Livingston return to the construction site. He arrived at approximately 3 o'clock, his carriage wheels crunching over the rutted ground, his expression suggesting a man who had enjoyed a leisurely meal and several glasses of wine, while those in his employ worked through the heat without food or water. He stepped down from the carriage with exaggerated care. One hand pressed to his lower back, a gesture of performative discomfort, as if the brief ride from his house on Broad Street had been an ordeal comparable to hauling 60-pound stones while 7 months pregnant. "O'Brien!" Livingston's voice carried across the site. "Progress report!" The foreman hurried over, removing his hat. From her position in the shed, Phyllis could hear fragments of their conversation. O'Brien was explaining that the stone hauling was on schedule, that the foundation trench was nearly complete, that they would be ready for the governor's inspection. He did not mention Diana. He did not mention that one of the workers was in premature labor in the equipment shed, her water broken, her body failing. To mention it would be to invite questions, to draw Livingston's attention to a situation that might reflect poorly on O'Brien's management. Better to keep it hidden, to hope Diana either recovered quickly or died quietly. "And the Negro workers?" Livingston asked. "No more incidents like last week?" "No, sir. They're performing adequately." "Adequately is not what I'm paying for." Livingston's voice sharpened. "The Schuyler contract next month depends on finishing this project on time. I cannot afford delays." Phyllis turned back to Diana, who had gone very still. For a moment, Phyllis feared she had died, that her heart had simply stopped under the accumulated weight of stress, dehydration, exhaustion, and premature labor. But then Diana's eyes opened, and Phyllis saw in them a terrible clarity, the look of someone who has moved beyond fear into acceptance. "He's talking about the next contract," Diana whispered. "He's already planning the next project. We're just tools that wear out." "Don't think about that now," Phyllis said. But she knew Diana was right. They were consumable resources in Livingston's calculus. The stone that Diana had dropped would last longer than Diana herself. The oak timbers being raised would stand for decades, while the people who raised them would be used up and discarded. This was the fundamental reality of slavery, the systematized conviction that black lives existed only to serve white accumulation of wealth, and that when those lives ended, through violence, neglect, or deliberate exploitation, their ending mattered only insofar as it affected property values and profit margins. Diana's breathing had become shallow and rapid, the pattern that preceded another contraction. Phyllis pressed her palm against Diana's belly and felt the muscles begin to tighten. "Try to breathe slowly," she instructed. "In through your nose, out through your mouth, like this." She demonstrated, though she knew it would do little good. No breathing technique could prepare a body for what Diana was enduring. The contraction built slowly this time, a wave gathering strength, Diana's hands clenched into fists, her fingernails digging crescents into her palms. She did not scream. She had learned long ago that screaming brought punishment, not help, but a low moan escaped her throat, animal and involuntary. The sound carried through the gap in the door. Across the construction site, several enslaved workers glanced toward the shed, their expressions carefully neutral. They knew what was happening. They had seen it before. They would see it again. Cuffy, the young man who had been watching Diana with concern earlier, made a decision that would later be recorded in the letters of Moravian missionaries who documented this case. He set down the timber he was carrying, wiped his hands on his breeches, and walked directly toward Robert Livingston. This was an act of extraordinary courage. Enslaved people did not approach white men without permission, did not initiate conversations, did not call attention to themselves. To do so risked punishment ranging from whipping to sale. But Cuffy had decided that bearing witness to Diana's suffering without attempting intervention was its own form of death. "Sir," Cuffy said, stopping at what he judged to be a respectful distance from Livingston. "Begging your pardon, sir." Livingston turned, his eyebrows rising in surprise and displeasure. "What is it? I don't recall giving you permission to stop working." "No, sir. It's just—" Cuffy searched for words that would convey urgency without sounding insubordinate. "There's a woman in the shed, sir. She's having her baby. She's in a bad way." O'Brien stepped forward quickly, his face flushing with anger and embarrassment. "I was handling the situation, Mr. Livingston. There was no need to bother you." "Handling it?" Livingston looked from O'Brien to Cuffy to the shed in question. "Which woman? Whose property?" "Diana, sir," Cuffy said. "She belongs to the widow Van Rensselaer. She's 7 months along, sir, and she's been working the stone detail all day in this heat without water, and now the baby's coming too early." The way Cuffy structured his statement was deliberate. He did not plead for mercy on humanitarian grounds. Such pleas fell on deaf ears among men like Livingston. Instead, he framed it as a property issue. Diana belonged to someone else. Her death would require compensation. The circumstances could be construed as mismanagement. This was the only language that might penetrate Livingston's indifference. Livingston's expression shifted from annoyance to calculation. He was indeed thinking about property values, about potential liability, about how Margaretha Van Rensselaer would react if her enslaved woman died under his supervision. The widow Van Rensselaer was well connected in Dutch colonial society, her family ties extending to the patroonships of the upper Hudson Valley. Offending her could damage Livingston's reputation and his access to future enslaved labor rentals. "Show me," Livingston said curtly. The moment Robert Livingston appeared in the doorway of the equipment shed, his bulky frame blocking most of the afternoon light, Diana's body went rigid with a terror that temporarily overrode even the pain of contractions. In the architecture of enslavement, white men's physical presence always signaled potential violence. They could beat you, sell you, rape you, kill you, and they could do all of these things without legal consequence, without social censure, without any force in the universe holding them accountable. Diana tried to make herself smaller, curling onto her side on the canvas tarps, as if by shrinking she could escape notice. Livingston stared down at her, his face unreadable in the shadowed interior of the shed. He saw a woman, though he did not truly see her as a woman in the full human sense, but rather as a female specimen of property, lying in a pool of her own sweat and amniotic fluid, her pregnant belly distended, her face the color of ash. He saw damaged goods. He saw potential financial liability. He saw an inconvenience that complicated his construction schedule. "How long has she been like this?" he asked O'Brien, who had followed him to the shed. "Maybe an hour, sir. I was going to wait until the day's work was finished to inform you." "An hour?" Livingston's tone suggested this was an unconscionable delay. "Van Rensselaer will want a full accounting if this woman dies. I'll need documentation that the death was not caused by negligence on our part." He turned to Cuffy, who stood just outside the shed. "You, what exactly did you observe?" Cuffy understood that he was being asked to testify in a way that would absolve Livingston of responsibility. But he also understood that his testimony might be Diana's only chance of receiving any kind of help at all. "She was working the stone detail, sir. Had been since dawn. The heat was terrible, sir, and she's 7 months pregnant, and I think she maybe didn't have water for most of the day." "Pregnant women worked throughout history," Livingston interrupted. "Pregnancy is not an illness. My own wife carried 3 children to term while managing household affairs." The comparison was grotesque. His wife had never hauled 60-pound stones in 96-degree heat, had never been denied water or medical care, had never labored under threat of whipping or sale. But Livingston seemed genuinely unable to perceive the difference. The dehumanization required to maintain slavery operated at such a profound level that it warped even basic logical reasoning. Inside the shed, Diana felt another contraction building. She tried to breathe through it, tried to stay silent, tried to remain invisible, but the pain was beyond her control now. Her body had entered the stage of labor where conscious will becomes irrelevant, where biology takes over with indifferent momentum. She gasped, then moaned, then screamed, a sound that cut through the afternoon air and silenced the entire construction site. Every enslaved worker stopped and turned toward the shed. In that moment of collective witness, something shifted. The individual suffering that had been forced into isolation became, briefly, a shared experience. 42 people stood frozen, listening to a woman's anguish, unable to help but refusing to look away. This was resistance of the only kind available to them. The refusal to pretend they did not see, did not hear, did not know what was happening. Livingston flinched at the scream, then recovered his composure. "Someone fetch a midwife," he said to O'Brien. "A cheap one. Don't spend more than 5 shillings, and make sure she understands that if this woman dies, it won't be on my account." O'Brien nodded and hurried away. Livingston lingered in the doorway a moment longer, looking down at Diana with an expression that might have contained a flicker of something human, pity, perhaps, or recognition, or discomfort with his own role in her suffering. But if such a flicker existed, it was quickly extinguished by the greater imperative of protecting his interests. He turned and walked back to his carriage, leaving Diana to Phyllis's care. "A midwife is coming," Phyllis whispered, though she had little faith that this would matter. Midwives in colonial New York ranged from skilled practitioners who had learned their craft through apprenticeship to desperate women who claimed the title with no training whatsoever. For 5 shillings, the cost of 2 chickens or a bushel of corn, Livingston would get whatever dregs of the profession were available on short notice. Diana's contraction peaked and began to subside. In the brief respite that followed, she opened her eyes and looked at Phyllis. "The baby's dying," she said flatly. "I can feel it. There's no movement anymore." Phyllis wanted to lie, to offer false comfort, but she owed Diana the truth. "Maybe," she said quietly. "Or maybe the baby's just conserving strength. Sometimes they go very still before birth, and sometimes they die inside you, and then you die trying to push out a corpse." Diana had seen this too. Every enslaved woman had seen it. Maternal mortality rates in colonial America were approximately 1 in 8 for white women with access to medical care. For enslaved women, the rates were significantly higher. Estimates suggested 1 in 5 or worse, though no one kept careful records of dead black women. They were losses to be written off in ledgers, not tragedies to be mourned or studied. The wait for the midwife stretched into 40 minutes. During that time, Diana experienced 3 more contractions, each stronger than the last. Her cervix was dilating rapidly, too rapidly for a first-time mother, but her body seemed to have decided that survival required speed. The baby needed to come out, living or dead, before Diana's body completely failed. Phyllis stayed beside her, offering water from the bucket, wiping her face with a relatively clean section of canvas tarp, speaking quiet words of encouragement that felt hollow even as they were necessary. Outside, the construction work had resumed, though the rhythm was different now. The enslaved workers moved more slowly, more deliberately, as if collective grief had weighted their bodies. No one sang or spoke. The usual banter that sometimes emerged among them, the brief moments of humanity asserted against dehumanization, had vanished. They worked in silence, and the silence was its own form of testimony. The midwife who finally arrived at 4:30 in the afternoon was a woman named Margaret Kirby, aged approximately 50, with the rough hands and skeptical eyes of someone who had attended hundreds of births and learned to expect the worst. She was white, poor, widowed, and existed on the margins of colonial society where proximity to the enslaved made her nearly as invisible as they were. The 5 shillings Livingston's foreman pressed into her palm represented a quarter of her monthly income. She took the money without comment and followed O'Brien to the shed, carrying a leather satchel that contained her limited tools: clean rags, a knife, scissors, thread for suturing, and a small bottle of laudanum that she reserved for paying customers. Margaret ducked through the shed doorway and assessed Diana with the practiced eye of someone who could calculate survival odds at a glance. Enslaved woman, 7 months pregnant, premature labor, dehydrated, exhausted, possibly hypothermic despite the heat. Shock could cause the body's temperature regulation to fail. The odds were not good. Margaret had attended enough enslaved births to know that her job was not to save lives, but to minimize property loss. If the mother could be saved, save her. If the baby could be saved, save it. If both died, make sure the deaths could not be blamed on the midwife's negligence. "How long between contractions?" Margaret asked Phyllis. 5 minutes, maybe less." Margaret nodded and knelt beside Diana. Without asking permission, enslaved women did not have the right to refuse medical examination. She pushed up Diana's shift and pressed her fingers against the distended belly. The skin was hot and tight. The baby's position felt wrong, not head down as it should be, but sideways or perhaps breech. Margaret's expression darkened. "Has the baby moved at all in the past hour?" she asked. Diana shook her head, unable to speak. Margaret pulled a small wooden stethoscope from her satchel, a hollow tube about 6 inches long, and placed one end against Diana's belly, the other end against her ear. She listened intently for the rapid flutter of fetal heartbeat. Nothing. She moved the stethoscope to a different position. Still nothing. A third position. A fourth. Finally, very faintly, she detected something, but it was slow, far too slow. A healthy fetal heartbeat at 7 months should be around 140 beats per minute. This was perhaps 80, and weakening. "The baby's in distress," Margaret said flatly. "Maybe already gone. Even if it comes out alive, it won't survive long. Too early. Too much stress." She looked at Phyllis, then at Diana. "The question is whether we can save the mother." Diana heard these words as if from a great distance. Her baby was dying or already dead. She herself might be dying. And this white woman with rough hands was discussing her survival in the same tone one might use to discuss whether a broken wagon wheel was worth repairing. She wanted to rage, to scream, to demand that someone, anyone, acknowledge that she was a person, that her baby was a person, that their lives had value beyond their economic utility. But she had no strength for rage. Pain had consumed her entirely. Another contraction seized her, and this time she felt something shift inside her, a sensation of tearing, of something giving way that should not give way. She screamed again, an animal sound of pure agony. Warm liquid gushed from between her legs, but it was not amniotic fluid or birth fluids. It was blood, too much blood. It soaked through the canvas tarps beneath her and began pooling on the packed dirt floor of the shed. Margaret saw the blood and swore quietly. "Placental abruption," she said to Phyllis. "The placenta's separating from the uterine wall. The baby's being cut off from oxygen and blood. If it wasn't dead before, it is now." She turned to the shed door and shouted, "I need more light and clean water and more rags." O'Brien appeared in the doorway. "Is she going to die?" "Probably," Margaret said bluntly. "The bleeding is bad. Even if the baby comes out quickly, she could bleed to death before we can stop it. I've seen it happen dozens of times." "Can you do anything?" Margaret was already pulling items from her satchel, the knife, the scissors, the thread. "I can try to deliver the baby quickly before she loses too much blood, but I make no promises, and I want it noted that she was already in critical condition when I arrived. Whatever happens, it's not my fault." This was the refrain of every white person involved in Diana's case. "Not my fault." Livingston would say it to Van Rensselaer. O'Brien would say it to Livingston. Margaret would say it to anyone who questioned her competence. The entire system of slavery was designed to ensure that no white person ever had to take responsibility for the black bodies that system destroyed. Diana felt herself slipping away. The pain had become so absolute that it transcended pain, becoming instead a white noise that filled her consciousness completely. She could no longer distinguish between her body and the world around her. The shed walls seemed to breathe. The voices, Margaret's, Phyllis's, O'Brien's, echoed and distorted. She thought about her mother, Abigail, sold away when Diana was 9. She thought about the baby inside her, dying or dead. She thought about the wall being built outside, the wall that would carry Wall Street's name, the wall that represented everything slavery had built in America. Prosperity for some, annihilation for others, and a deliberate forgetting of the bodies buried in the foundations. Margaret positioned herself between Diana's legs and pressed her hands against Diana's belly, trying to determine the baby's position. "It's breech," she confirmed. "The feet are coming first. This is going to be difficult." She looked up at Phyllis. "Hold her shoulders. Keep her as still as possible." Phyllis moved into position, gripping Diana's shoulders gently but firmly. Their eyes met for a moment of human connection that transcended the horror of their circumstances. "I'm here," Phyllis's expression said. "You're not alone. I see you. I will remember you." "Push," Margaret commanded Diana. "Push now as hard as you can." Diana pushed. The pain exploded into something beyond naming, beyond endurance. She felt her body splitting apart, felt tissues tearing, felt blood flowing in quantities that could not be survived. She pushed again, driven by biology and desperation. Something moved inside her, shifting downward. Margaret worked quickly, her hands slick with blood, trying to guide the baby's feet, then legs, then torso through Diana's cervix and birth canal. The baby was tiny, perhaps 3 pounds, but still large enough to cause catastrophic damage to a body already pushed beyond its limits. Diana pushed a 3rd time, and the baby's body emerged up to the shoulders. "One more," Margaret said. "One more push, and the head will come." But Diana had nothing left. Her vision had gone completely grey. Her heartbeat stuttered irregularly in her chest. She could no longer feel the contractions, or the pain, or her own body. She was floating somewhere above the scene, looking down at the woman on the blood-soaked tarps, wondering distantly if that woman was her. Phyllis leaned close to Diana's ear and whispered, "Stay with me. Just one more. You can do this. Diana, stay here." The use of her name, the acknowledgement that she existed as an individual with an identity beyond enslaved woman or property, brought Diana back into her body for one final moment. She gathered what remained of her strength and pushed. The baby's head emerged. The small body slipped fully out into Margaret's waiting hands. The baby did not cry. Margaret Kirby held the infant in her blood-slicked hands and knew immediately that she was holding a corpse. The baby, a girl she noted distantly, was perfectly formed but utterly still. The skin had already taken on the waxy pallor of death, the lips tinged blue-grey. No breath, no heartbeat, no flicker of life. The child had likely died hours ago, while Diana was still hauling stones in the merciless July heat, her body desperately trying to sustain 2 lives on no water and minimal oxygen while being worked beyond human limits. Margaret laid the tiny body on a relatively clean section of canvas and turned her attention back to Diana, who was bleeding at a rate that would kill her within minutes if not stopped. The placenta had not yet delivered, and it needed to come out, or Diana would hemorrhage to death. Margaret pressed her hands against Diana's abdomen, feeling for the placenta, trying to massage the uterus into contracting and expelling the afterbirth. "Come on," Margaret muttered, more to herself than to Diana. "Contract! Come on!" But Diana's uterus had exhausted its ability to respond. The muscle was flaccid, unresponsive, unable to perform the crucial final stage of labor that would stop the bleeding. Blood continued to pour from Diana's body, soaking through the canvas, pooling on the dirt floor, spreading in a dark stain that reflected the late afternoon light, filtering through the shed's gaps. Phyllis watched the blood spread and understood that she was witnessing a death, Not a quick death, those were almost merciful in comparison, but a slow drowning in one's own fluids, a gradual shutdown of systems, an extinguishing of consciousness degree by degree. She kept her hands on Diana's shoulders, kept her face close enough that Diana could see her if Diana's eyes opened again, kept breathing steadily so that Diana could hear the rhythm of life even as her own life drained away. "The baby?" Diana's voice was barely audible, a thread of sound. Phyllis hesitated. The truth was cruelty, but lies were disrespect. "She's gone," Phyllis said quietly. "She's at peace now. She didn't suffer." The last part was a lie. The baby had almost certainly suffered during the hours of oxygen deprivation before death, but it was a lie born of love, a lie meant to give Diana some fragment of comfort in her final moments. Diana's face crumpled. Tears slipped from the corners of her eyes, running down her temples into her hair. She wept silently, her body too depleted for sobs. Margaret worked desperately, her hands deep inside Diana's body now, trying to manually extract the placenta. This was dangerous. It could cause infection, could tear the uterine wall, could make the bleeding worse. But Diana was dying anyway, and Margaret's professional pride demanded that she try everything before admitting defeat. She felt the placenta's spongy mass and began pulling gently, carefully, trying to ease it free without causing additional damage. The placenta came away in pieces. This was the worst possible outcome. Retained placental fragments virtually guaranteed fatal infection, even if the hemorrhaging could be stopped. Margaret stared at the fragments in her hands, then at Diana's ashen face, and knew that her work here was finished. There was nothing more to be done. Diana would die. It was only a question of when, minutes or hours, but not days. "I'm sorry," Margaret said, and she meant it. In her 50 years of life, she had attended perhaps 800 births. She had seen perhaps 100 women die in childbirth. Most of those women had been enslaved. The disparity was not coincidental. Enslaved women received the worst care, worked until moments before delivery, often labored alone, or with only other enslaved women for assistance. Margaret had become inured to these deaths in the way that anyone who witnesses systemic violence eventually becomes inured. But some small part of her humanity still recoiled at the waste of it all. She gathered her tools, wiped her hands on a rag, and stood. Her knees cracked audibly. "There's nothing more I can do," she said to Phyllis. "Keep her comfortable. She has maybe an hour, maybe less. When she's gone, let O'Brien know so they can dispose of the bodies." "Bodies," Phyllis repeated. "Not Diana and her baby, not a mother and child. Bodies. Property that had ceased to function, waste to be disposed of." Margaret left the shed without looking back. She found O'Brien near the construction site's main timber pile and reported her findings in the clinical language of professional detachment. Patient was already in extremis upon arrival. Placental abruption, fetal demise, maternal hemorrhage, attempted manual extraction, unsuccessful, prognosis, death imminent. She collected her satchel and departed. The 5 shillings in her pocket, another dead enslaved woman added to the mental ledger she no longer consciously counted. O'Brien received this information with a grimace of annoyance. He would need to report Diana's death to Livingston, who would need to report it to Margaretha van Rensselaer, who would demand compensation for the loss of her property. There would be negotiations, possibly legal proceedings, if Van Rensselaer felt she had been defrauded. The whole affair would be tedious and time-consuming. He glanced at the shed, then away, unwilling to actually see what was happening inside. "Let me know when it's done," he told Cuffy, who had remained near the shed since his initial intervention. "Then get some of the men to help you bury them. Do it tonight, after work stops. Use the plot behind Trinity Church where they bury the other ones." The other ones referred to the growing cemetery where New York's enslaved dead were buried in unmarked graves. By 1711, the burial ground already contained several hundred bodies, men, women, and children, who had died from violence, disease, exhaustion, and neglect. The cemetery would continue to grow for another century, eventually holding an estimated 15,000 bodies before it was closed, forgotten, and finally rediscovered in 1991 during construction of a federal building. The African Burial Ground, as it would eventually be known, would become one of the most important archaeological sites in American history, revealing the scale and brutality of Northern slavery that the historical narrative had conveniently erased. But in 1711, it was simply the place where dead enslaved people were disposed of, quickly and without ceremony, so that the living could continue working without disruption. Inside the shed, Diana's consciousness flickered in and out. She was aware of Phyllis beside her, aware of her own body's failure, aware that she was dying. But she was also aware of something else, a strange clarity that sometimes comes at the threshold between life and death. She understood with perfect lucidity that her death was not an accident or a tragedy or an unfortunate coincidence. Her death was murder, premeditated, systematic, legal murder. Robert Livingston had murdered her by forcing her to work in conditions no human body could survive. The colonial government had murdered her by creating laws that defined her as property rather than person. Margaretha van Rensselaer had murdered her by renting her out while pregnant. Every white colonist who participated in or benefited from the slave economy had murdered her, and the murder would go unpunished, unacknowledged, erased from history as thoroughly as her body would be erased in an unmarked grave. "Phyllis," Diana whispered. Phyllis leaned closer. "I'm here." "Tell them," Diana said. "Tell them what happened. Tell them my name. Tell them I was here. Tell them I mattered." "I will," Phyllis promised. "I swear it. On my life, on my ancestors, on everything holy, I will tell them." Diana's hand found Phyllis's and squeezed weakly. "And tell them about her. My baby. She had a life, even if it was short. She was a person. She deserved to be born into freedom. She deserved—" Diana's voice broke. "She deserved better than this." "She did," Phyllis agreed, tears streaming down her face now, no longer caring about the waste of water or the luxury of grief. "You both did. This should never have happened." "Oh." The sun began its descent toward the Hudson River, painting the western sky in shades of orange and crimson that seemed obscenely beautiful given what was happening in the equipment shed. The construction site's activity gradually slowed as the workday approached its end. Enslaved laborers completed their final tasks with the methodical exhaustion of people who knew that rest was temporary, that tomorrow would bring identical suffering, that this cycle would continue until their bodies gave out entirely. Inside the shed, Diana's breathing had become shallow and irregular, the breathing pattern called Cheney-Stokes respiration, where breaths come in clusters followed by long pauses, a sign of imminent death. Her body had lost too much blood to maintain basic functions. Her heart struggled to pump what little blood remained. Her brain, starved of oxygen, began shutting down non-essential systems. She was dying by degrees, each system failing in sequence, like candles being extinguished one by one. Phyllis stayed beside her, holding her hand, speaking quietly. She told Diana about her own childhood on the Gold Coast, about the village she barely remembered, about the day the slavers came and took her and 20 others from her community. She told Diana about the Middle Passage, the 2 months in the slave ship's hold, chained in her own waist, watching people die around her and be thrown overboard like garbage. She told Diana about arriving in New Amsterdam at age 12, being sold to a Dutch merchant, learning to survive by making herself useful and invisible simultaneously. She told these stories not because Diana asked for them, but because bearing witness was the only form of resistance available. If Diana died alone and forgotten, the violence of her death would be compounded by erasure. But if Phyllis bore witness, remembered, and eventually testified, then Diana's death would at least be documented, acknowledged, made real in the historical record. Diana listened, or perhaps did not listen. It was impossible to tell. Her eyes were half closed, her expression distant. But Phyllis continued speaking anyway, filling the shed with words, with memory, with the insistence that enslaved people were human beings with histories and stories, and worth beyond their economic value. Outside the shed, Cuffy and Prince waited with the grim patience of people accustomed to death. They had volunteered to handle the burial, knowing that this was their final act of care for Diana, their final chance to assert that her life and death mattered. They had brought shovels from the tool area and a length of canvas to wrap the bodies. They stood at a respectful distance from the shed, not wanting to intrude on Diana's final moments, but wanting to be near enough to act quickly when needed. Robert Livingston made a final appearance at the construction site around 6 o'clock. He arrived not to check on Diana, her survival or death was now O'Brien's problem to report, but to inspect the day's progress on the wall. He walked along the foundation trench, examining the stonework, nodding with satisfaction. The project was nearly on schedule. The stones that Diana had hauled, the stones that had killed her, were now permanently embedded in the foundation. Her blood and sweat had literally mixed with the mortar. Wall Street was being built with her life as surely as it was being built with oak and stone. "Excellent work," Livingston said to O'Brien. "Another week, and we'll be ready for the timber frame. Tell the workers they've done well." He paused, then added as an afterthought, "What about the pregnant woman?" "Dying, sir. The midwife said there was nothing to be done. Should be over by nightfall." "Unfortunate," Livingston said, in the tone one might use to describe a broken tool or a lost shipment. "Make sure Van Rensselaer receives a full report. Include the midwife's assessment. I want it clear that we did everything reasonable under the circumstances." "Yes, sir." Livingston climbed back into his carriage and departed. He would go home to his house on Broad Street, where his wife and 3 healthy children awaited him. He would eat dinner: roast beef, potatoes, fresh bread, wine, prepared and served by enslaved workers. He would sleep in a comfortable bed, in a room cooled by evening breezes from the harbor, and he would wake tomorrow to continue building his fortune on the systematic destruction of human beings he refused to recognize as human. In the shed, Diana's breathing stopped, then resumed, then stopped again. Each pause grew longer. Phyllis felt Diana's pulse, faint, irregular, fading. She leaned close and whispered, "You can let go now. Your baby is waiting for you. Your mother is waiting for you. The ancestors are waiting. You don't have to fight anymore. You can rest." Diana's eyes opened one final time. She looked at Phyllis with an expression of profound exhaustion and profound peace. Her lips moved, forming words that made no sound. "Thank you." Then her breathing stopped. Her hand went limp in Phyllis's grip. Her eyes, still open, lost their focus and stared at nothing. Diana was gone. Phyllis sat motionless for a long moment, still holding Diana's hand, unwilling to release it and make the death official. She had held many hands in death. This was not her first time bearing witness to an enslaved person's dying, but each death felt like a small annihilation of her own humanity. Every time someone died under these conditions, something inside the survivors died too. Finally, she lowered Diana's hand gently to her side and stood. Her knees protested. She had been kneeling for hours. She stepped out of the shed into the golden evening light and found Cuffy and Prince waiting. "She's gone," Phyllis said simply. The 2 men nodded and entered the shed. They moved with practiced efficiency born of necessity. This was not the first body they had buried. Cuffy wrapped Diana's body in canvas. Then Prince wrapped the baby's tiny form separately. They would be buried together, mother and child, in the same unmarked grave. "We'll take them now," Cuffy said to O'Brien, who had appeared to confirm the death. "To the burial ground behind Trinity." O'Brien nodded. "Be quick about it, and be back here at dawn tomorrow. The work continues." Of course the work continued. It always continued. Enslaved people died, and the work continued. Children were born into slavery, and the work continued. Families were separated and the work continued. The machine of slavery required constant feeding, and individual lives were merely fuel to be consumed. Cuffy and Prince carried the wrapped bodies through the darkening streets of Lower Manhattan. A few white colonists they passed looked away, uncomfortable with the visible reminder of slavery's cost. Most ignored them entirely. Enslaved people carrying corpses were such a common sight in colonial New York that they barely registered as noteworthy. The African burial ground lay on the northern edge of the settled area of Manhattan, just beyond the wooden palisade that would give Wall Street its name. It was a plot of land approximately 6 acres in size, officially designated for the burial of enslaved Africans, because they were not permitted to be buried in the churchyards that served white colonists. Trinity Church, the Anglican establishment that dominated Lower Manhattan's religious and social life, maintained its own cemetery exclusively for white Christians of good standing. The enslaved dead were relegated to this separate space, a geography of death that reflected the geography of life in colonial New York. By the time Cuffy and Prince arrived, carrying Diana and her baby, full darkness had fallen. They brought a single lantern that cast flickering shadows across the burial ground's uneven terrain. The site was already crowded with graves, some marked with simple wooden crosses or stones, most completely unmarked, their locations known only through memory and oral tradition. The dead here included men who had worked themselves to death on the docks, women who had died in childbirth, children who had succumbed to disease or malnutrition, and individuals who had been executed under New York's brutal slave codes. Archaeological excavations conducted in the 1990s would reveal that many of the bodies buried here showed signs of extreme physical trauma. Bones broken and healed multiple times, indicating repeated injury. Vertebrae compressed from carrying excessive loads. Teeth worn down from using them as tools, evidence of malnutrition and disease. The burial ground was a repository of suffering, a physical archive of slavery's violence inscribed in bone and earth. Cuffy and Prince chose a spot near the eastern edge of the burial ground, where the soil was sandy and easier to dig. They took turns with the shovels, working in silence, the only sounds the bite of metal into earth and their own labored breathing. Digging a grave was hard work, especially after a full day of construction labor, but they approached it with a solemnity that bordered on sacred ritual. This was their chance to give Diana something that slavery had tried to deny her: a burial with witnesses, with intention, with care. They dug down approximately 4 feet, deep enough to protect the bodies from animals, shallow enough to complete before exhaustion claimed them entirely. When the grave was ready, they lowered Diana's wrapped body into it gently, carefully, as if she could still feel pain. Then they placed the tiny bundle containing her baby beside her, positioned so that mother and child lay together. Before filling in the grave, Cuffy pulled from his pocket a small carved piece of wood, a charm or amulet of some kind, worn smooth with age and handling. It had belonged to his own mother, who had died when he was young, and who had told him it would protect him in the next world. He placed it beside Diana's body. "For your journey," he said quietly. "You're free now. They can't touch you anymore." Prince added a handful of shells he had collected from the East River shore, a tradition he dimly remembered from stories his grandmother had told about West African burial practices. The shells were meant to guide the dead across the water that separated the living world from the world of the ancestors. Whether Diana's spirit would indeed make that journey, whether there was any justice or peace waiting for her beyond death, Prince did not know. But the gesture mattered. The intention mattered. The refusal to let her disappear without ceremony mattered. Phyllis had followed them to the burial ground, unable to let Diana go without seeing her properly laid to rest. She stood at the edge of the grave and spoke words that mixed Christian prayer with fragments of her own ancestral language, creating a hybrid liturgy that reflected the religious syncretism forced upon enslaved Africans. She asked God or the ancestors, or the universe, or whoever was listening, to receive Diana and her baby with mercy, to grant them the peace that had been denied them in life, to remember them when the living world forgot. Then they filled in the grave. Earth covered the canvas-wrapped bodies. Diana and her unnamed daughter disappeared into the ground. When the grave was full, Cuffy and Prince tamped down the soil and covered the disturbed earth with leaves and branches to make it less obvious. Marked graves were sometimes disturbed by vandals, by developers, by people who saw the burial ground as wasted land that could be repurposed for profit. "We should put something here," Prince said, "so we can find it again, so we can remember exactly where she is." Cuffy looked around and found a stone roughly the size of a man's head. He placed it at the head of the grave, not a proper headstone, not inscribed with Diana's name or dates or any information about who she had been, but a marker nonetheless. A small act of remembrance in a world determined to forget. The three of them stood beside Diana's grave for several minutes, each lost in their own thoughts. They thought about their own deaths, which would almost certainly come under similarly brutal circumstances. They thought about the hundreds of other enslaved people buried here, their names and stories lost to history. They thought about the fundamental injustice of a society that could work a pregnant woman to death and call it legal, call it normal, call it simply the cost of doing business. Finally, because they had to be back at the construction site at dawn and exhaustion was claiming them, they turned to leave. As they walked away, Phyllis looked back one last time at the stone marking Diana's grave. "I won't forget," she said aloud, making the promise again. "I swear I won't forget." But even as she spoke, she knew the terrible truth. Forgetting was built into the system. Slavery required forgetting. It required treating the enslaved as nameless, interchangeable units of labor. It required erasing their humanity, their individuality, their stories. And even with the best intentions, even with sworn promises, memory was fragile. Phyllis herself might die before she could tell Diana's story to anyone who would listen. Or she might tell it, and no one would care. Or people would care, but lack the power to change anything. The historical record bears out her fears. Diana's death was recorded in the municipal records of New York, but only as a property loss to be adjudicated between Livingston and Van Rensselaer. The record reads, July 14, 1711, Negro woman Diana, property of M. Van Rensselaer, deceased during labor while employed on fortification project. Cause, complications of premature childbirth. Infant also deceased. Compensation claim pending. No mention of the work conditions, no mention of the denied water, no mention of being forced to haul stones while 7 months pregnant in extreme heat. Just a bureaucratic notation of property damage. The only reason Diana's story survived at all was because of a group of Moravian missionaries who were active in New York at the time, and who made it their mission to document cases of particularly egregious cruelty toward enslaved people. A missionary named Johann Martin Mack recorded Diana's case in his journal, including details he gathered from interviews with Phyllis and other witnesses. His journal entry, dated August 3, 1711, provides most of the information that allows Diana's story to be reconstructed more than 3 centuries later. But Mack's journal was not published during his lifetime. It sat in the Moravian Church archives in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, largely unread for 200 years. Diana's story remained buried, literally and figuratively, alongside the thousands of other stories of enslaved people whose suffering the dominant historical narrative chose to ignore. The morning after Diana's death arrived with the same oppressive heat that had killed her. The construction site resumed operations at dawn, 41 enslaved workers instead of 42, the absence barely noticed by anyone except those who had known Diana. Robert Livingston arrived at 8 o'clock to inspect progress and was pleased to see that the previous day's tragedy had not significantly impacted productivity. O'Brien had replaced Diana with another enslaved woman, a teenager named Judith, rented from a different owner. who was already hauling stones along the same route Diana had walked to her death. The wall continued to rise. Oak timbers were fitted into the stone foundation. The structure began to take its intended shape, a defensive palisade that would run from river to river, protecting white colonists from potential attacks, while literally and symbolically dividing enslaved people from even the theoretical possibility of freedom. The irony of enslaved people building their own cage was lost on no one except those who benefited from their labor. Livingston's compensation dispute with Margaretha van Rensselaer took 3 weeks to resolve. Van Rensselaer initially demanded £75, significantly more than Diana's assessed value, claiming that Livingston's negligence had destroyed valuable property. She cited the midwife's testimony about dehydration and overwork, argued that a pregnant woman should not have been assigned to heavy labor, and insisted that Livingston bore full responsibility for the loss. Livingston countered that pregnancy did not excuse enslaved people from work, that Diana's death was an unfortunate accident rather than the result of negligence, and that Van Rensselaer had failed to disclose Diana's fragile condition when leasing her out. He offered £20 as a goodwill gesture, emphasizing that he was under no legal obligation to pay anything at all, since Diana had technically died from childbirth complications rather than from work-related injury. The dispute was eventually arbitrated by a colonial magistrate named William Smith, who ruled that Livingston owed Van Rensselaer £40, roughly Diana's market value, as compensation for her death. Smith's written decision, preserved in the New York colonial court records, provides a window into the legal reasoning that governed enslaved people's lives. He wrote, "While it is true that Negro women have been known to work throughout pregnancy without ill effect, and while it is also true that the defendant Livingston cannot be held criminally responsible for deaths occurring during childbirth, it is the judgment of this court that the defendant exercised insufficient caution in deploying pregnant Negro property in heavy labor during extreme heat conditions. The plaintiff, Van Rensselaer, is therefore entitled to compensation for her property loss, said compensation to reflect the market value of a healthy Negro woman of childbearing age. However, the plaintiff's claim for additional damages based on lost future productivity is denied, as the court finds no evidence that the deceased Diana would have produced more than the average number of offspring had she survived. The decision was purely economic. Diana's death was adjudicated like the loss of a horse or a shipment of goods. The £40 changed hands. Van Rensselaer used the money to purchase a younger enslaved woman. Livingston absorbed the cost as a business expense and continued his construction contracts. The legal system had functioned exactly as designed, protecting white property interests while ensuring that no white person faced meaningful consequences for black death. The Moravian missionary, Johann Martin Mack, learned about the case through his contacts in New York's small but growing abolitionist community. Mack was 34 years old, German-born, educated at the University of Jena, and newly arrived in the American colonies with the express purpose of ministering to enslaved Africans and advocating for their freedom. He was part of a broader Moravian effort to challenge slavery on religious grounds, arguing that all humans were children of God and therefore could not righteously be held as property. Mack interviewed Phyllis in late July, meeting with her secretly in the basement of a sympathetic Quaker family's home. Phyllis told him everything: Diana's pregnancy, the work conditions, the denied water, the premature labor, the death of mother and baby, the burial in the unmarked grave. She spoke for nearly 2 hours, her voice steady but her hands trembling, reliving the trauma of witnessing Diana's death. Mack recorded Phyllis's testimony in his journal with remarkable detail. He wrote in German, which would ironically help preserve the account. English colonial authorities, who might have confiscated or destroyed abolitionist materials, could not easily read German texts. His entry for August 3, 1711, fills 6 pages of dense handwriting and includes not just the facts of Diana's case, but also Mac's own moral outrage. I have today learned of a crime so monstrous that it shakes my faith in the goodness of my fellow Christians. A woman, a human soul, a child of God, a person with thoughts and feelings and hopes, was worked to death while carrying a child in her womb. She was denied water. She was forced to carry stones that would break a strong man. And when she died, her death was treated as nothing more than a financial inconvenience. How can we call ourselves civilized? How can we claim to follow Christ's teachings while participating in such barbarism? The judgment will be severe for those who profit from such evil. Mac attempted to bring Diana's case to wider public attention. He wrote letters to church leaders in Pennsylvania and Europe, describing her death as an example of slavery's fundamental incompatibility with Christian morality. He preached sermons that referenced her story, though he often had to speak obliquely to avoid being expelled from colonies where slavery was economically essential. He even tried to convince colonial authorities to prosecute Livingston for manslaughter, though this effort went nowhere. The legal system that had adjudicated Diana's death as a property matter was not about to recharacterize it as a crime. Most of Mac's contemporaries, including many who considered themselves good Christians and decent people, dismissed his concerns. Slavery was legal, they argued. Slavery was economically necessary. Slavery was sanctioned by biblical precedent. Didn't the Old Testament contain rules for owning slaves? And besides, Africans were naturally suited for hard labor, felt less pain than Europeans, were happier when given clear direction and firm discipline. These racist rationalizations were so deeply embedded in colonial culture that even people of genuine goodwill struggled to see past them. The construction of Wall Street's fortification was completed in September 1711. 3 months after Diana's death. The finished walls stood 12 feet high, constructed of oak logs sharpened to points at the top, with gun positions every 200 feet. It stretched 2,240 feet from the Hudson to the East River, a massive undertaking that had consumed thousands of hours of enslaved labor and directly resulted in at least 4 documented deaths, including Diana's. Robert Livingston received his final payment from the colonial government, £300, and immediately secured another contract to build a series of warehouses near the East River docks. These warehouses would be used primarily for storing goods produced by enslaved labor: tobacco from Virginia, rice from the Carolinas, sugar from the Caribbean, indigo from Georgia. The entire economic system was a closed loop of exploitation, with enslaved people producing goods, enslaved people building the infrastructure to store and transport those goods, and white colonists accumulating wealth from every stage of the process. The wall itself stood for less than a century. By the 1760s, as the threat of attack diminished and the city expanded northward, sections of the wall were dismantled. The timber was reused in other construction projects. The stone foundation was gradually covered by street paving and building construction. By 1699, no, that's wrong again. By 1799, the wall was completely gone, surviving only as a street name that would eventually become synonymous with American financial power. Wall Street became the center of New York's financial district in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. The New York Stock Exchange was founded in 1792 with the signing of the Buttonwood Agreement, which established rules for trading securities. Throughout the antebellum period, Wall Street firms financed the domestic slave trade, provided credit for Southern plantation owners, insured enslaved people as property, and profited enormously from cotton produced by enslaved labor in the South. The connection between Wall Street and slavery was direct and undeniable. Northern banks provided the capital that Southern planters used to purchase enslaved people. Insurance companies like Aetna, founded in Hartford, Connecticut in 1853, issued policies on enslaved people's lives, treating human beings as insurable assets like ships or warehouses. The textile industry in New England, the economic engine of northern industrialization, ran on cotton picked by enslaved hands. Wall Street was literally and figuratively built on slavery, its foundations mixed with the blood and bones of people like Diana. But this history was systematically erased from public memory. As the 19th century progressed, and northern states abolished slavery within their own borders, a convenient myth emerged. Slavery was a southern problem, a moral failing of southern planters, an institution foreign to the enlightened North. Northern businessmen who had profited from slavery rebranded themselves as abolitionists after it became socially advantageous to do so. Northern cities that had been slave societies for centuries rewrote their histories to minimize or eliminate references to their own participation in the slave trade. Diana's grave, along with the thousands of other graves in the African burial ground, was quite literally paved over. As Manhattan expanded northward in the 19th century, buildings were constructed directly on top of the burial ground. City planners showed no concern for the bodies buried there. They were simply obstacles to be worked around or ignored. By the mid-20th century, the location of the African burial ground had been completely forgotten by all but a few historians and members of New York's black community who maintained oral traditions about the site. In 1991, during excavation for a new federal office building at 290 Broadway in Lower Manhattan, construction workers discovered human remains. Archaeological investigation revealed that the construction site was located on top of the African burial ground. Over the next year, archaeologists would excavate 419 burials from a small portion of the 6-acre site. The remains told stories of extraordinary hardship. Children with growth arrest lines in their bones, indicating periods of severe malnutrition or illness. Adults with musculoskeletal trauma consistent with heavy labor. Individuals buried with artifacts suggesting West African cultural practices that had survived the Middle Passage. The discovery sparked intense public debate and activism within New York's black community, led by figures like historian Michael Blakey and activist Peggy King George. They demanded that the excavation be stopped, that the remains be treated with proper respect, and that the site be preserved as a memorial rather than built over once again. Their activism was successful. In 1993, the African burial ground was designated a National Historic Landmark, and in 2006 it became a national monument. Among the 419 sets of remains excavated, archaeologists found the skeletons of several pregnant women who had died in childbirth or shortly before. One burial in particular, labeled Burial 340 by the archaeological team, consisted of a woman approximately 25-30 years old, buried with a fetus of approximately 28 to 32 weeks gestation. The woman's skeleton showed evidence of severe anemia and malnutrition. Her teeth were worn in a pattern consistent with using them as a tool, perhaps for processing fiber or leather. Her vertebrae showed compression consistent with carrying heavy loads. Was Burial 340 Diana? It's impossible to say with certainty. The burial was located in a section of the cemetery that likely dates to the early 18th century, consistent with Diana's death in 1711. The age, pregnancy status, and evidence of hard labor all match. But without written records directly linking a specific burial to a specific individual, archaeological identification remains speculative. What is certain is that Burial 340 represents someone whose story was almost identical to Diana's. An enslaved woman worked to death during pregnancy, buried in an unmarked grave, forgotten by history until archaeological excavation restored at least some measure of her existence to public knowledge. Whether that woman was Diana or someone else, her bones testify to the same systemic violence that killed Diana and thousands like her. The legal framework that made Diana's death possible was not an accident or an aberration, but rather the result of careful, deliberate construction by colonial legislatures determined to extract maximum profit from enslaved labor while minimizing any obligation to treat enslaved people humanely. New York's slave codes, like those of other colonies, were revised and expanded throughout the 17th and 18th centuries, each revision further entrenching the system and closing off avenues for freedom or legal protection. The 1702 Act for Regulating Slaves in New York established the foundational principle that enslaved people were chattel property rather than persons under the law. The Act specified that enslaved people could be bought, sold, traded, inherited, and seized for debt like any other property. It prohibited enslaved people from owning property themselves, testifying against white people in court, gathering in groups without white supervision, traveling without written passes, or learning to read and write. The 1706 amendments added provisions specifically designed to terrorize enslaved people into compliance. Enslaved people who struck a white person, even in self-defense, could be executed. Those who attempted to run away could be mutilated. Ears could be cropped, tendons could be cut, brandings could be applied. Those who destroyed property could be burned alive. The punishments were deliberately spectacular and public, meant to serve as warnings to the entire enslaved population. Most relevant to Diana's case, the 1706 amendments explicitly stated that owners could not be prosecuted for the death of their own enslaved property, regardless of the circumstances. The law read, "If any slave shall die by reason of any stroke or blow, given in such correction by his or her owner, or by reason of any accidental casualty or unwillful act, such owner shall not be liable to prosecution or penalty." This created legal immunity for even the most egregious acts of violence, as long as the perpetrator could claim that death resulted from correction or accident. The law did include one narrow exception. If a person killed another person's enslaved worker, the killer could be sued in civil court for property damages. This is what allowed Margaretha van Rensselaer to pursue compensation from Robert Livingston. But notably, the legal framework treated this as a property dispute, not a wrongful death case. The question before the magistrate was not, did Livingston cause Diana's death through negligence or abuse, but rather, what is the fair market value to compensate Van Rensselaer for her financial loss? This legal architecture was replicated throughout the American colonies with minor variations. Virginia's slave codes were particularly brutal, as were South Carolina's. But northern colonies like New York, Massachusetts, and Rhode Island had their own comprehensive legal frameworks supporting slavery. The myth that northern states were somehow less complicit in slavery than southern states cannot survive even cursory examination of the historical record. The North participated enthusiastically in slavery for more than 2 centuries, and northern legal systems were specifically designed to facilitate that participation. The economic incentives driving these laws were overwhelming. By 1711, New York's economy depended heavily on enslaved labor. The colony's major industries, shipping, shipbuilding, dockwork, construction, food processing, domestic service, and small-scale agriculture all relied on enslaved workers. Wealthy families owned an average of 5 to 10 enslaved people. Even middle-class artisans and shopkeepers often owned 1 or 2. The total enslaved population of approximately 1,500 people in a colony of 7,000 represented an enormous concentration of wealth, estimated at roughly £200,000 sterling in aggregate property value. Disrupting slavery would mean disrupting the entire economic system. It would mean confronting the fact that white prosperity was built on black suffering. It would mean acknowledging that the comfortable lives of colonial elites depended on the systematic brutalization of human beings. Most white colonists were unwilling to contemplate such disruptions, so they constructed elaborate ideological justifications for slavery's continuation. Religious justifications were particularly important. Pro-slavery clergy argued that slavery was sanctioned by the Bible, pointing to passages in Leviticus and Ephesians that discussed slave-owning without explicitly condemning it. They claimed that Africans were descendants of Ham, cursed by Noah to be servants of servants, and therefore naturally suited for enslavement. They insisted that slavery was actually beneficial to Africans who were being Christianized and civilized through their bondage. These arguments were theologically bankrupt. They relied on selective reading of Scripture, creative interpretation, and willful ignorance of Christianity's core teachings about human dignity. But they were powerful because they allowed good Christians to participate in evil without experiencing cognitive dissonance. Pseudo-scientific justifications emerged alongside religious ones. European physicians and natural philosophers in the early 18th century were beginning to develop racial theories that classified humanity into distinct categories with supposedly inherent differences in intelligence, physical capacity, and moral character. These theories, which would reach their grotesque culmination in the 19th century with phrenology and scientific racism, claimed that Africans were biologically inferior to Europeans, less intelligent, less capable of complex thought, more suited for physical labor, and less sensitive to pain. These racist pseudo-scientific claims directly impacted how enslaved people were treated. If Africans supposedly felt less pain, then brutal working conditions were not really brutal. If they supposedly required firm discipline to control their savage impulses, then violence was not abuse, but necessary management. If they supposedly lacked the capacity for higher emotions like parental love, then separating families was not traumatic, but simply efficient resource allocation. Every aspect of slavery's cruelty was rationalized through layers of ideology designed to protect white people from confronting what they were actually doing. Diana's death was thus not an anomaly, but rather the logical outcome of a system that denied black humanity at every level: legal, economic, religious, and philosophical. Robert Livingston worked her to death because he genuinely did not believe her life mattered beyond its economic value. The legal system declined to prosecute him because it was designed to protect white property rights, not black lives. The broader society accepted her death with indifference because centuries of ideological conditioning had taught white colonists to see black suffering as normal, natural, and ultimately unimportant. The testimony collected by Johann Martin Mack provides rare insight into how some white colonists did recognize slavery's evil but felt powerless to stop it. Mack interviewed not just Phyllis, but also several white witnesses who had observed Diana's working conditions and felt troubled by what they saw. One witness, a Quaker craftsman named Benjamin Elkins, told Mack, "I saw the woman carrying stones in the terrible heat, her belly so large she could barely walk, and I thought to myself, this is wrong, this is murder. But what could I do? If I spoke up, I would be dismissed as a troublemaker. If I tried to help her, I would be accused of interfering with another man's property. The system makes monsters of us all, even those of us who wish to be good." Elkins's testimony captures the moral cowardice that allowed slavery to persist. Many white people recognized slavery's brutality, but chose not to act because action would require sacrifice, social ostracism, economic loss, physical danger, or simply the discomfort of confronting their own complicity. It was easier to look away, to convince themselves that they as individuals bore no responsibility for a system they merely participated in without creating. But this logic was and is morally bankrupt. The Holocaust was not committed solely by Hitler and Nazi leadership, but by millions of ordinary Germans who participated in or enabled genocide. The Rwandan genocide was not committed solely by extremist leaders, but by hundreds of thousands of ordinary citizens who killed their neighbors. And American slavery was not maintained solely by a few brutal slaveholders, but by millions of white Americans, North and South, wealthy and middle class, religious and secular, who participated in, benefited from, or passively accepted a system of racial terror that lasted for 2.5 centuries. Diana's death indicted not just Robert Livingston, but an entire society. Every white colonist who bought goods produced by enslaved labor, who hired out enslaved workers, who voted for representatives who supported slavery, who attended churches that preached pro-slavery theology, who remained silent when they witnessed abuse, all of them bore responsibility. And their descendants, who inherited wealth built on slavery, who lived in cities and states whose infrastructure was constructed by enslaved labor, who benefited from racial hierarchies that survived slavery's formal abolition, they too inherited a debt that has never been repaid. The Moravian missionary community's efforts to document and publicize cases like Diana's had limited immediate impact, but proved historically significant. Johann Martin Mack and his colleagues created an archive of testimony that would eventually provide crucial evidence for abolitionist movements in the late 18th and 19th centuries. Mack's journal entries, along with similar documents produced by Quaker abolitionists, would be cited by anti-slavery activists like William Lloyd Garrison, Frederick Douglass, and Harriet Beecher Stowe as proof of slavery's fundamental barbarity. Phyllis herself lived another 37 years after Diana's death, surviving until 1748. She remained enslaved for most of her life, though she was eventually manumitted by her owner's will when she was in her late 60s, a freedom that came only after her productive years were exhausted and she was no longer economically valuable. In her final years, she lived in a small room provided by a Quaker charity in Lower Manhattan, supporting herself through laundry work and midwifery. Phyllis never forgot Diana. She told Diana's story repeatedly to anyone who would listen, to other enslaved people, to free black New Yorkers, to sympathetic Quakers and Moravians, to her own grandchildren who had been born free under New York's gradual emancipation law. The story became part of the oral tradition within New York's black community, passed down through generations, transformed through retelling, but never completely lost. In 1746, 2 years before her death, Phyllis gave testimony to a Quaker abolitionist committee that was collecting evidence of slavery's cruelties to present to the colonial assembly. Her testimony about Diana was recorded by the committee secretary and preserved in the Friends Archives in Philadelphia. The testimony reads in part, "I knew a woman named Diana who was worked to death in the summer of 1711. She was 7 months with child and was made to carry heavy stones in terrible heat without water. Her baby died inside her, and then she died trying to birth the dead child. Her owner was paid for losing her, like she was a broken cart, and the man who worked her to death went on to make more money from other such projects. This is what slavery is. It is the murder of people whose names you will never know, whose graves you cannot find, whose stories are erased before they are even finished. I'm telling you Diana's story so that someone will remember, so that her death will mean something, so that someday people will know what was done to us." The Quaker Committee's petition to the Colonial Assembly failed. The assembly, dominated by slaveholders and merchants who profited from the slave trade, rejected the petition without serious consideration. It would be another 80 years before New York began the gradual process of emancipation, and another 150 years before slavery was completely abolished in the United States through civil war and constitutional amendment. But Phyllis's testimony was preserved. It survived in the archives. And when historians in the 20th and 21st centuries began reconstructing the history of northern slavery, documents like Phyllis's testimony provided invaluable evidence that slavery in the North was not a benign institution of household servitude, but rather a brutal system of exploitation that killed thousands. The archaeological excavation of the African burial ground in the 1990s provided physical corroboration of testimonies like Phyllis's. The bones told stories that written records had tried to erase. Skeletal analysis revealed patterns of trauma, malnutrition, and overwork that matched exactly the accounts given by enslaved people and abolitionist observers. The burial ground became, in the words of historian Michael Blakey, an archive of slavery's violence written in bone. The creation of the African Burial Ground National Monument in 2006 represented a partial reckoning with New York's history. The monument includes a memorial designed by architect Rodney Leon, featuring an ancestral chamber where visitors can descend below ground level to contemplate the burial site. The design deliberately evokes the experience of descending into a ship's hold during the Middle Passage, creating a visceral connection to the trauma of enslavement. The walls are inscribed with the names of African ethnic groups and regions from which enslaved people were taken, acknowledging the specific identities that slavery tried to erase. But the monument also reveals the limits of historical reckoning. Diana's name does not appear on any memorial inscription because her grave was never definitively located. She is honored only as part of the Anonymous Collective, one of the estimated 15,000 people of African descent buried here, as the monument's text states. Her individual story, preserved through Phyllis's testimony and Mac's documentation, is known to historians but not to the general public. Most visitors to the African burial ground have never heard of Diana, never learned that Wall Street was built by enslaved people like her, never confronted the direct connection between colonial slavery and modern American capitalism. This is the persistent challenge of historical memory. How do we honor the dead when so many died anonymously? How do we tell individual stories when the system deliberately destroyed individuality? How do we create memorials for people whose names we don't know, whose graves we cannot find, whose lives were systematically erased? Diana's story provides one possible answer. Through the determination of people like Phyllis and Johann Martin Mack to document what they witnessed, through the preservation of archives that could easily have been lost or destroyed, through the work of modern historians committed to excavating hidden histories, Diana exists in the historical record. Not completely. We don't know her surname, her exact birth date, her parents' names, or many other details that would make her fully three-dimensional, but we know enough to say she was real. She lived, she suffered, she died, and her death mattered. The creation of narratives like this one, detailed, researched, emotionally engaging reconstructions of documented historical cases, serves a specific purpose. It refuses the erasure that slavery depended upon. It insists that enslaved people were individuals with unique stories, not just anonymous units in an economic system. It connects past violence to present structures, showing how institutions like Wall Street have histories that implicate them in slavery's crimes. And it creates opportunities for contemporary audiences to develop emotional connections to historical injustice, potentially motivating them to address slavery's ongoing legacies. The legacies of slavery that killed Diana persist into the 21st century in forms both obvious and subtle. Wall Street remains the center of American financial power, and that power continues to be shaped by racial hierarchies that have their roots in slavery. Studies of wealth inequality consistently show that Black Americans have approximately 1/10 the wealth of white Americans, a gap that is directly traceable to slavery and its aftermath. Enslaved people were forcibly prevented from accumulating wealth for 2.5 centuries. After emancipation, they faced legal discrimination, terrorist violence, and systematic exclusion from wealth-building opportunities like home ownership and business ownership. The GI Bill, which helped create the white middle class after World War II, was administered in racially discriminatory ways that largely excluded black veterans. Redlining practices prevented black families from buying homes in appreciating neighborhoods. Employment discrimination limited access to high-wage jobs. The result is that contemporary racial wealth gaps reflect the accumulated impact of centuries of racial oppression, beginning with slavery. When we see that the median white family has $171,000 in wealth, while the median black family has $17,600, we are seeing slavery's legacy. When we see that black women experience maternal mortality at rates 3 to 4 times higher than white women, we are seeing slavery's legacy. When we see that black people are incarcerated at 5 times the rate of white people, we are seeing slavery's legacy as it transformed into convict leasing, Jim Crow, and mass incarceration. Diana died building Wall Street. Her literal body, her sweat, her blood, her bones, became part of the physical infrastructure of American capitalism. But her death also contributed to the ideological infrastructure that continues to devalue black life. The legal system that treated her death as property damage rather than human tragedy established precedents that reverberated through Reconstruction, Jim Crow, and into the present. The police violence that kills black people with impunity today echoes the legal immunity that protected slaveholders. The political rhetoric that describes black communities as infested and black protesters as thugs draws from the same well of dehumanization that allowed colonists to work pregnant women to death. Confronting this history requires more than acknowledging that slavery was bad. It requires understanding that slavery was foundational, that American prosperity was built on slavery, that American legal and political institutions were shaped by slavery, that American racial hierarchies originated in slavery's requirement to justify the unjustifiable. It requires recognizing that the past is not past, that history is not distant, that decisions made in 1711 continue to shape life in 2025. What would reparations for slavery look like? At minimum, they would involve massive wealth transfers to compensate for centuries of stolen labor and systematically denied opportunities. They would involve comprehensive reforms of institutions, criminal justice, education, healthcare, housing that continue to perpetuate racial inequality. They would involve truth-telling on a national scale, ensuring that every American learns the full history of slavery, including Northern complicity, including the specific ways that contemporary institutions were built on enslaved labor. But reparations would also need to be symbolic and memorial. They would need to involve naming the dead, marking the graves, telling the stories. They would need to ensure that people like Diana are not forgotten, that their suffering is acknowledged, that their humanity is affirmed retrospectively, even though it was denied in their lifetimes. The African Burial Ground National Monument is a start, but it is only a start. Every city that participated in slavery needs similar memorials. Every institution that profited from slavery needs to acknowledge that history publicly and materially. Diana's story ends in an unmarked grave in Lower Manhattan, her body returned to Earth, her name nearly lost to history. But the story of what killed her, the ideology of white supremacy, the economic system of racial capitalism, the legal framework that treated humans as property, that story did not end with her death. It continues, transformed but recognizable in the structures that shape American life today. To remember Diana is to commit to dismantling those structures. To honor her death is to refuse the forgetting that allowed slavery to be normalized, that allowed segregation to be legalized, that allows racial inequality to persist. To tell her story is to insist that Black lives matter, not as a political slogan, but as a fundamental moral truth that American society has never fully embraced. The wall that Diana died building was eventually torn down. The street that replaced it bears the same name, but serves a different function. The burial ground where she rests was paved over and then rediscovered. History has a way of burying things and then exposing them again. The question is whether we, confronted with what history exposes, will have the courage to truly see it, to truly acknowledge it, and to truly change because of it. Diana's baby daughter never received a name in the historical record. She died before birth, before she could be baptized, or registered, or acknowledged as a person. But she was a person. She had the potential for a life, for experiences, for relationships, for joy. That potential was stolen by a system that valued property over people, profit over humanity. This unnamed baby girl represents all the futures that slavery destroyed. Every enslaved person who died prematurely was not just an individual loss, but also the loss of descendants who would never be born, of contributions that would never be made, of joy that would never be experienced, of lives that would never unfold. The violence of slavery was not just what it did to those who lived through it, but what it prevented from ever existing. If we could speak to Diana now, across the centuries that separate us, what would we say? "I'm sorry" seems inadequate. Sorry does not return her life. Sorry does not give her baby a chance to live. Sorry does not undo the system that killed her or prevent its legacies from continuing to kill. Perhaps what we owe Diana is not apology, but action. We owe her the work of dismantling white supremacy wherever it persists. We owe her the work of building a society where black women can give birth without fearing for their lives, where black children can grow up without being stalked by premature death, where black families can accumulate wealth and pass it to their descendants without systematic theft. We owe her the work of truth-telling, of memory-keeping, of refusing to forget even when forgetting would be more comfortable. Diana died on July 14, 1711, in a tool shed on a construction site in Lower Manhattan, in agony and terror, denied dignity in death as she had been denied dignity in life. But she lived, she existed, she mattered, and 314 years later, her story is told again, remembered again, honored again, not because it has a happy ending, it doesn't, but because the truth of what happened to her and millions like her is necessary for any honest reckoning with American history. Her name was Diana. She was 28 years old. She was 7 months pregnant. She died building Wall Street. She deserved better. They all deserved better. And we owe them the debt of memory, the debt of truth, and the debt of building a future that finally honors their humanity. Her story will not be forgotten.